So when you heard I was going to be talking about genetics, what did it mean to you? What did you think about? Did you think about inherited features from your ancestors? Did you think about, oh yeah, I mean, I act the way I do because that's the way the men in my generation, or the men in my family have for generations? Did you think about the nose that you had inherited from your mother? What did you think about when you thought about that word genetics? Did you think about genetically modifiable food? That's certainly a topic that's out there a lot right now. Did you think about the forensic aspect of genetics, about DNA fingerprinting? That certainly happens to be one of my interests as a hobby, and I actually love the show called CSI, which is on right now as we're talking, which it does a lot about crime solving through genetics and DNA fingerprinting. Or did you think about medical advances, about some of the new genetic tests for susceptibility to cancer, to Alzheimer's disease, to a number of common disorders that are being talked about now? It's interesting that of the 10 leading causes of death, 9 seem to be causally related to genetic factors, all of these common diseases that you hear about all the time. And the one that we think isn't, let's say injury, you think, how could that be genetic? But you've probably heard that there's some possibility of a gene for recklessness, reckless behavior, which is probably a contributing factor to a lot of the injury that happens. So you may say, well, is everything genetic? Well, I would say no, because unfortunately about 50% or more of the premature death and disability is caused by things that we do to ourselves or to others, like smoking, diet and exercise, alcohol, drugs. So what I'm planning to talk about tonight is a little on the history of genetics, partly because of the day that it is, a primer on genetics and some of the words that we use in this area, tell you a little about the Genome Project, which I think is going to change the face of medicine over the next 10 to 20 years. We'll do some examples of genetics problems and disorders, and perhaps Mike and I can have more of a discussion with you about that afterwards. Some of the risks and benefits of genetic testing, and maybe some of my future predictions about how genetics may play a role in your life. So the Human Genome Project, this is one of the largest international biomedical research projects ever. It's been going on for 15 years. And its goal is to create a high-resolution map of these approximately 30,000 genes on the 46 chromosomes. As of January the 5th this year, the sequencing was almost 96% finished. So this is really the ultimate map, the sequence of genes in our genome. But by itself, it's really like just giving you a telephone book without the names. So you would really get all the numbers, but not the names. So you would have a whole lot of sequences, but not really know what they do. So the real impact is going to come when we actually figure out how to make the words and sentences, how to get the meaning out of these sequences of genes. We know now that there's about 1,000 genes that are responsible for susceptibility to disease. But we've got 30,000 genes, so there's a lot of work to go. So here's another quiz for you about similarity. How about a mouse and a human? How similar are we at the messenger RNA level? Now you're probably already getting the gist of this, so it's not so much fun anymore to guess at these numbers, but here we're about 85% similar at the messenger RNA level. So it's very interesting about the mouse and the human. Some of you may have heard about the whole Harvard mouse case, the issue of whether a mouse that can be used for medical experiments should be patented. It's interesting that both species have about 30,000 genes, and only 300 are unique to the human compared to the mouse. So the mouse is actually an excellent model for human disease. This doesn't have too much to do with my talk, but it's kind of an interesting perspective on genetics. So if you're interested in these kind of trivia about genetics, if you go onto the Nature website, it's easily accessible. If you just put in Nature on your search, you will actually be able to find this article on the human genome, and it actually tracks the progress of the coding and sequencing. So if you go on, I gave a similar talk in November to the first mini med school, and I was able to see the progress of genetic tracking by going back on it before this talk. So the question is, what will the Human Genome Project, what impact will it have on health promotion and disease prevention, and what impact will it have on our society? Some people have very high hopes for genetics. So what impact is mapping the genome going to have on health and illness? Well, we already are using genetics to diagnose and detect many disorders. In prenatal care, we're using genetic testing for disorders such as Down syndrome, muscular dystrophy, neural tube defects. Newborns and children can be screened for cystic fibrosis. And there is now susceptibility testing for many adult onset disorders, particularly some of the cancers, such as breast ovarian cancer, colorectal, and you heard about melanoma. We're going to talk about these in a few minutes. I want to just tell you a bit about hereditary cancer first, though. First of all, it's important for you to know that all cancers are genetic. And what I mean by that is that cancer is the result of a cascade of DNA mutations in several genes that allow for the cells to just grow in an uncontrolled fashion. So that's really what cancer is, cells growing in a very uncontrolled fashion, probably related to some genetic mutations. But most of these cancers are what we call sporadic. So we don't know what caused them, we don't know why it happened. And the mutation has occurred in what we call the somatic cells in your body. So those mutations are not passed on to your children. You've developed those mutations probably as an adult or as a child, and you can't pass them on. The cancers that I'm talking about today are what we call hereditary. And that means that there's a gene mutation that's in your germline cells, or the cells, really the basic original cells that are passed on as part of your inheritance, so through the egg or through the sperm. So those mutations can be passed on through families. So there's quite a difference here in what we're talking about. So a mutation, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about a really terrible alteration in the structure or function of the protein that ends up causing disease. So you can see there's been some kind of terrible mutation up here in the DNA that results in an error in the messenger RNA so that the protein is altered. And in most cases, it means that the protein is truncated or shortened so that it's unable to carry out its proper function. So how would you know if you were part of one of these hereditary cancer families that I'm talking about? Well, you would probably have several relatives on the same side of the family who have cancer. More than one generation would be affected with the same kind of cancer or very similar cancers. And usually the cancer would have been diagnosed at a young age. So in people who are younger than 50, and particularly if there are cancers in the family under the age of 35, that would raise sort of a red flag that you might be from a hereditary cancer family. So take a look at Mary, for example, here. Here's Mary, who is 40. So she has a mother who died of ovarian cancer at the age of 48. She has a sister who was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at the age of 40, and she has another sister with breast cancer diagnosed at the age of 38. And she has a niece who was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 30. So these are the kind of families that would raise a flag for a family doctor or a cancer specialist that this might be an inherited form of breast or ovarian cancer. And you can see why. It's multiple generations, people at a young age getting breast or ovarian cancer. So what are the issues for Mary? Well, I'm sure she has a lot of questions. Has she inherited this disease? Is she likely to get breast or ovarian cancer? What about her daughter and her sons? When should her daughter start having mammograms? What should she do about this? What advice should she give her brother, who may also have inherited this? Has he passed it on to his daughter? So these are the kind of questions that are raised in this kind of situation. So first of all, what's the average woman's chance of getting breast cancer in her lifetime? This is the number many of you will know, which is the 1 in 9. So let's just talk about breast cancer for a minute. 80% of women have an average risk of breast cancer, where the cause is unknown, and age is still the biggest factor, or biggest risk factor for getting breast cancer. So the older a woman gets, the higher risk she is of getting breast cancer. 20% of women have a family history of breast or ovarian cancer. And if you have one first-degree relative, and a first-degree relative means a parent, a sibling, or a child who has breast or ovarian cancer, if you have one first-degree relative under 50 with breast cancer, you have 2 times the risk of getting breast cancer. But here's the people we're talking about in this talk about the hereditary cancer syndromes. About 5% of women with a family history of will have hereditary breast cancer, where they've inherited a gene mutation that puts them at increased risk of getting breast or ovarian cancer. We've now discovered more than 400 mutations in the 2 genes that seem to be responsible for this hereditary breast cancer. These genes, when they're functioning properly, stop the growth of tumors. They repair damaged DNA. So when they're mutated, they're unable to repair this damaged DNA and tumors can grow. So who has these mutations? The frequency of this mutation is about 1 in 1,000 in the general population and about 1 in 50 in Ashkenazi Jews. So these are Jewish people who have usually originated in Northern Europe. Each child of someone who carries this mutation has a 50% chance of having it themselves. So what does it mean if you carry the gene for hereditary breast cancer? Well, there's an increased risk of getting breast cancer, up to about 85% risk of getting breast cancer by the age of 70 compared to 11% risk in the general population. So you can see what a huge difference it makes having this mutation. They have an increased risk of ovarian cancer, up to about 40% chance of getting ovarian cancer by the age of 70, compared to less than 1% of the general population. And men are not immune to this. If they've inherited the mutation, they have up to 15% risk of prostate cancer, compared to 3% in the general population. A common myth in genetics is people think that women inherit from their mothers and men inherit from their fathers. Of course, not true, because you inherit equally. So that a man has a 50% chance of inheriting the hereditary breast or ovarian cancer gene from his mother or his father and can pass that on to his children. Another myth, just while we're on myths, is that you've inherited the same genes as the parent you look the most like. Well, you've inherited some of them, but you certainly haven't inherited all of them. So it obviously doesn't mean they're going to behave the same way medically. So what can testing, genetic testing for susceptibility to cancer tell you? Well, if you had a positive genetic test for one of these inherited cancer syndromes, it obviously tells you you're at increased risk for that specific cancer. The problem, though, with genetic testing today is, first of all, it doesn't tell you would get it for sure. So the risk of getting breast cancer if you carry this gene mutation ranges anywhere between about 45 and 85%. It also doesn't tell you that you'll get it for sure. It also doesn't tell you when you'll get it, what age. Are you going to get it at 50 or are you going to get it at 90? And it doesn't tell you how bad the cancer will be. So you can see it's pretty inexact and can cause a lot of anxiety because we just don't have the answers. A negative genetic test, if your family has a known genetic mutation, tells you that you have the same risk of getting that type of cancer as the rest of the population. This is pretty complicated, so we're going to go through a little more about this in a minute. Just as another example, colorectal cancer is another example of an inherited cancer kind of syndrome. And you'll see the pattern is very similar to hereditary breast cancer. The chance of getting colorectal cancer in your lifetime normally is about 6%. And about 75% of people are at average risk of getting colon cancer. 20% of people have colon cancer in a first-degree relative. If you have one first-degree relative with colon cancer, you're at twice the risk. But if you have one first-degree relative colon cancer under 45, you have 5 times the risk. So again, if it's at a younger age, it makes a difference. 5% seem to have this hereditary colorectal cancer syndrome, and that means they carry a gene that predisposes or makes them more susceptible to getting colorectal cancer. And they then have an 80% risk of getting colon cancer. So what should you do if any of these stories sound like your family? You should certainly talk to your family physician about your family history. And if you're at increased risk, if you meet some of the criteria that are laid out for these high-risk families, you might consider being referred to a genetic center to see a specialist, a geneticist, or a cancer specialist who specializes in this area. So genetic testing is available. It's certainly available at many centers in Toronto and at a number of regional genetic centers. Genetic testing itself is very simple for you in that it's only a blood test, but it's not so simple in its implications. It's covered by OHIP if the criteria are met for testing. So what the basic process under which you have to go is that if you were interested in having this testing and you thought you had a family history with this kind of risk, a person in your family needs to be tested first who actually has cancer. Because looking for the genetic mutation is like looking for a needle in a haystack. And if you know the needle is likely to be there, you're more likely to go looking for that person first. So that, for instance, with Mary and my story, if one of her relatives with cancer was willing to have genetic testing, she would be the first person tested. And if a mutation was found, then testing would be offered to the rest of her family members. It's only in exceptional circumstances that people can have genetic tests where there are no family members living with cancer who are willing to be tested. And we won't go into those in detail, but particularly in the situation of Ashkenazi Jews where there may not be family members living, there are particular gene mutations that can be tested for. So what are the risks of genetic testing? I mean, why wouldn't all of you want to have genetic testing? Well, I certainly wouldn't advise that, first of all. And what you're going to see in my examples, first I've presented cancers, I'm going to present a couple of other examples. These cancers, these two cancers are really the only cancers that are now being tested for, I guess other than melanoma. So we don't have tests for every kind of cancer, that's the first thing. If you had a negative test, you might think that you'd just be thrilled to find that you didn't carry the mutation. But what we found is that often in these families, people feel very guilty. They suffer from what we call survivor guilt, where many members in their family have died of a particular kind of cancer, and they wonder why they were spared, and perhaps their siblings or parents are not. There's the risk of complacency. People think if they don't have the gene mutation, they don't have to do the regular screening or mammograms or examinations. Many of these genetic tests results are uncertain. Just because a mutation isn't found, let's say in Mary's family no mutation is found, it may mean that we just haven't found that mutation yet, because we've only found about 400 at this point. Positive test results often result in anxiety, depression, guilt at passing on the genetic mutation to your children. There can often be major family issues. It may be that perhaps a fellow in a family finds out that he's carrying the gene for hereditary colorectal cancer, and then he has the responsibility of notifying other members of his family. They may be family members that you're not close to anymore. You may have had major arguments with them and you don't talk anymore. A sibling may not want to know their test results. I mean, all kinds of things can start to happen in families when you talk about these things. These tests are different than just having your hemoglobin measured or your blood sugar, because they have ramifications through your whole family. If you have the test and find out you have the mutation, everyone else in your family may possibly be carrying that mutation, and they may not have wanted to know, thank you very much, but you've now told them. There may be issues about insurance. Fortunately, in this country, it's not going to affect your health insurance, but in the United States, this is a huge issue, and a number of people are not choosing to have testing because they think it will affect their health insurance. There's also, of course, issues of confidentiality, and perhaps we can talk about that later, but if you think about the situation where I'm a family doctor for a whole extended family, and one person chooses to have genetic testing and finds out they're positive, and asks me not to tell anybody else. So what do I do with the rest of the family members who I now know could be at increased risk? They're going to wonder why I'm ordering mammograms at 30 instead of at 50. I mean, it's going to seem pretty weird, and if I don't order them, how am I going to feel when I know they could be at increased risk? So there's huge implications here that no one's really thought about yet or knows what to do. So you might have genetic testing because if it was negative, you would be relieved from some anxiety. You might be prevented from having unnecessary surgeries or treatments. And a positive test result might mean that you could benefit from increased surveillance or preventive options. So if you found out you had the gene for hereditary breast cancer, you would probably start mammography at the age of 25. You would probably have ultrasound surveillance for ovarian cancer screening at 25 or 30. There is almost no evidence at the moment for any of these recommendations I'm giving you because it's just too soon. So these recommendations are really based on the advice of experts and the experience we have so far. But we won't have the results of these randomized trials really for another few years. If you found out you had the gene for hereditary colorectal cancer, you'd probably start colonoscopy at about the age of 25, or 5 years younger than the relative who had the earliest diagnosis. So you can see these are much earlier interventions than you would have if you didn't have the gene mutation. We know that about 10% of people over 70 have memory loss, and probably about 50% of these have Alzheimer's disease. I'm sure you're familiar with the symptoms from the talk you had last session. And you know that the causes include aging, genetic predisposition, and perhaps exposure to some of these environmental agents. Now let's talk about genetic testing for this disorder. First-degree relatives, so remember that means a parent, a sibling, or a child, of people with Alzheimer's disease have a lifetime risk of 20 to 25% of getting it themselves. So that's twice the usual risk. And there is a genetic basis. This apolipoprotein E4 is associated with Alzheimer's disease. Having it does not mean that you're necessarily going to get Alzheimer's, and not having it doesn't mean that you won't get Alzheimer's disease. So here's the real dilemma with this kind of genetic testing. So would you want to have a genetic test that would tell you that you have the gene marker, you have the genetic mutation for Alzheimer's disease, but we can't tell you whether you're going to get it or when you're going to get it, and we can't treat it really? So would you want to know? So for me, this is an example of a genetic test that's not really ready for prime time at this time. Now, when I presented this in November, a number of people came up to me afterwards and disagreed with me on this. So an elderly gentleman in the audience said that he would actually want to have the test because if he knew that this was likely to happen to him, he would get his affairs in order and he would just feel better. He would know what was likely to happen to him. He would prepare things with his family, which I think is fair enough. But again, remember that the test doesn't just apply to you. So if you have the test and you find out that you're carrying the gene for Alzheimer's disease, your 16-year-old great-grandson now knows that he has quite a possibility of getting this too. And how would that affect his life? Would he change his educational plans, his life dreams? Because you don't know if you're going to get it or when you're going to get it, and we can't stop it. So I think when you hear about these new genetic tests that you're going to hear a lot about in the newspaper and magazines and on the radio and TV, I think you have to think about it each time. What does it mean? How certain is it? Is there anything I can really do about it that would make a difference? And do I really want to know? And if you can answer all those and it makes sense, then go ahead and think about having it. But these are very complicated and very different than medicine has been until now. So this slide, I think, just goes through what I just said. So there is, in spite of what I've just said, there's the occasional family history that's striking in the sense of Alzheimer's disease, where people are getting it at very young ages and very commonly. And I think in those situations, it is worth at least discussing it with a geneticist, so you get your individual risk and decide whether you want to have testing or not. So you can certainly see, I hope from what I've talked about so far, that genomic medicine is really changing medical practice, because what we're talking about here is certainly different than when I went through med school. We didn't do any of this kind of testing at that time. I predict that really in the next 10 years, we're likely to have genetic tests that predict your susceptibility to maybe a dozen common conditions. But the problem with all these common conditions, like heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, osteoporosis, these are all diseases that have a genetic component. But they're what we call multifactorial diseases. So they have a genetic component, but they also have a huge influence of the environment and other factors that contribute. So I think that you're going to be offered these kind of tests. You may be able to learn about your susceptibilities. You may be able to take risks to prevent these diseases, but it's certainly not going to be the whole answer. The thought is that we'll have these gene chips that you'll have in a little plastic card in your wallet that will carry what's called your microarray, will carry your risks of all these diseases. So you might carry a little chip that says you're at increased risk of colon cancer, attention deficit disorder, you may get high blood pressure, and you have an allergy to penicillin. So your doctor would just put that in their little machine and say, okay, looks like you better get exercising and eat high fiber. It could be that kind of thing that sort of happens. Some of you may have seen Gattaca, which was a movie about genetic testing, where people took a hair and put it into a little booth, like a little ATM machine. And what that gave you was the personality profile of the person whose hair you took. So people did that as a precursor to any kind of dating, just to make sure who they were going out with. So, it's fascinating what's possible. So I think genetics is likely to change our lives by allowing us to know about our health and disease predispositions. It certainly will show that we're all mutants, because we all have mutations. It's going to show how similar we are to some people and how different we are in other ways. It may change our lives through what I call genetic determinism. If you find out that you have the gene for something, are you just going to give up and say, well, if I have the genetic predisposition to lung cancer, I might as well smoke. What difference is it going to make? It's certainly possible that it could do that for some people. It really raises the issue of nature versus nurture. What's most important, environment or genetics? It raises the issue about access to care. Are we going to create a section or a sector of the population that are genetically discriminated against? It raises issues of confidentiality and privacy of information. The right to know or not know. Will you have the right to say you don't want to have genetic testing, or will you have to have genetic testing? Will you have to act if you find out about it? It raises the issue of informed consent, because these are very complex tests, and the issues of patenting and licensing. We've talked about some of these things at the beginning, the issues of discrimination, of social stratification. We know now that many pharmaceutical companies are including genetic testing in their clinical trials. And this can be of great benefit to us in the future in some ways, because they will be able to develop drugs that match your genetic profile. So they'll be able to say, if you have this genetic profile, you should take drug A because it won't give you any side effects, and not drug B, because they'll be able to match your genetic profile to the side effect profile. So some of these are very positive, some of them are scary.